Pastor Plek's podcast. I'm your host, Pastor Plek. I'm so glad all of you are joining us. And in studio with me is none other than Eastside Community Church pastor Holland Greig. Welcome, Holland.
Thank you so much.
You know, we got a question from our people, and as you know, we are here to answer questions. That's what we do on Pastor Plek's podcast. And Holland, I got a question that only probably you can answer. But no, here it is. How does the church address the upcoming elections, specifically voting according to Christian principles? And you and I had a little bit of discussion about this week, and I wanted to kind of talk about, like, as we're approaching November 5th, I believe, isn't that right? The Super Tuesday, we are going to be voting for either President Trump or Vice President Harris to take over the country and lead the charge into the next 4 years. And so how should we as Christians sort of deal with that reality? What are your thoughts there, Holland?
Yep. I think this is an issue that I would say there's not a lot of teaching on what the Bible actually says about government and rulers, what God's expectations for rulers are, how we should think about government as Christians. Because
I think there's this reality that aren't we not supposed to talk about that? You know, I feel like there's
that's what we're told.
Yeah, there's this like unwritten rule. You're not supposed to talk about politics or mix religion and politics or something along that lines. And I think for the most part, you could say that you would say Christianity isn't political. However, I think one of the things I love that you've said over the years is that Jesus is king, and so therefore clearly political.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Bible speaks a lot to lesser kings. Jesus is the King of kings, meaning all kings, all rulers, obviously, are accountable to him for how they rule.
Yep.
And God's word has a lot to say about what the expectations for rulers are. The idea of, not mixing church and politics and stuff, I think there's some misunderstanding around where that idea comes from, what it means, what the Bible has to say about that.
Yeah.
A lot of it comes back to that idea of the separation of church and state, and what does that mean? And I think there's a lot of confusion about that. And so most talk about politics is just kind of like, hey, love the people that you disagree with politically and have unity, and not actual teaching and discipleship about how to think biblically with regard to government, authority, rulers, that type of thing.
All right, so let's talk real quick. I know you did a sermon series on this recently, which I was privy to see, I think, one of the messages. But God has a unique relationship, God and the government, God and the church, God and the family. And I love the way that you broke those three things down. Talk to me a little bit about how you see that breaking down, where you got that thought process from.
Yeah, the idea of God establishing three institutions of the family, the church, and the state or the government is something that's been acknowledged or recognized throughout her church history in a lot of ways. And that was what our sermon series was about, was understanding what God's will for each of those institutions is, and that each one has a unique mandate from God, and there is some overlap between all of them, but they're not the same. And so God has a specific purpose that the family fulfills that is not the same as the purpose that the church fulfills or that the government fulfills, even though there's some overlap. God's called the church, for instance, to make disciples, to practice, church membership, church discipline, administer this, when you practice like the Lord's Supper, baptism, sacraments or ordinances, whichever one you call them.
Right.
And the government, Romans 13, talks about the institution of the government is designed by God, instituted by God, that God's given the government the sword to punish, essentially to promote what is good and to punish what is evil. That's the government's mandate from God. And so that's not what the church is called to do. Right. But there is some overlap in the sense that you can have people who belong to the church or belong to a family that are also part of a government, or, if there's an issue, let's say, of abuse in a family, the church is going to speak to that from a disciplinary standpoint. The state might speak to that from a legal standpoint. So there's overlap in these three things, but they're distinct institutions that God has a specific call for. And this is what I'm saying, I think doesn't get much teaching today.
Yeah, so here's, and this is, I think the idea of church, and I don't want to call it separation of church and state, because I think we've all we understand maybe that premise, but how about toleration, religious toleration, where you don't promote one religion over another has not been a thing, really. The United States really coming in to its existence, where it didn't have like the Anglican Church in England, or whatever, maybe the Catholic Church in France, where there wasn't a primary religious institution. It was like just generally, they made laws initially that said like, hey, we're gonna, federally, Saturday and Sunday are off. But for the most part, up until the American Revolution, whatever the religion of the monarch was the religion of the entire state, for the most part.
Yeah.
And then what you saw with Christianity with democracy, and a republic democracy at that, is now, instead of like you just kind of you're receiving the religion of the state and the laws that monarch are putting forward. For example, the monarch may implement, you're going to be Catholic, and anybody not Catholic, you're off with your head. That sort of reality, where the morality was the faith tradition of that monarch, to then a democracy where there isn't a faith tradition that's supported by the state in any way other than freedom of general religion. And so how do we as Christians lean into that? And what should we be looking for as people who now may not be the monarch, but we have a role in deciding what is law for our country?
Yeah, so I would, even just to back up a little bit, when the separation of church and state thing, you're saying, I think we, for the most part, kind of get that. I would say I think that's an area that a lot of people don't understand what that phrase means or where it comes from.
Yeah.
It has to do with what you were just describing. Originally comes from, I believe, a letter from Thomas Jefferson talking about a wall of separation, but the purpose was to protect the church from government overreach.
Right.
From saying, hey, you have to be Catholic, or you have to, be Anglican, or whatever it is. The freedom of religion was originally intended, the freedom to worship God according to your conscience. But it was in the context of the Christian faith still. So it wasn't religious tolerance was about, different expressions of
I think
faith
he wrote
in God.
In that letter, what does it matter if there's 3 gods or 20 gods? It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And I think that's the reference that he gives to this sort of like, why are we so worried about something that, in a sense, you couldn't prove, I guess is where he was going with that, as he was a theist and clearly not a Christian. But yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, the overall religious context of the day, though, like if you look at the state constitutions, original colonies, even every state constitution today, I think, if not every, then like 48 out of 50 references Almighty God or a supreme judge of the earth or like a supreme deity, like all still make reference to God. My point is saying that separation of church and state is not about separation of God and state.
Right.
And so there's still, and that's something that people misunderstand today, because now people are saying, hey, don't bring religion into politics at all. Keep God out of the government. That is never what separation of church of state was intended to mean, and it's not how the founders of our country thought about that idea either.
Right. I mean, it was a primarily Judeo-Christian. In fact, this is part why I probably should get my sources right, but there's, without the Judeo-Christian backdrop construct, a nation with freedom of religion that we're talking about isn't possible. I think it's kind of where that came from.
Yeah, and the idea of having being able to enjoy freedom and liberty requires, I posted some quotes about this recently, requires right religion, requires virtue. Otherwise, that freedom devolves into destruction. And like if you don't have a source that you're accountable to as a government for morality, a standard of truth and justice and morality, then essentially the government becomes God.
Right.
The government becomes the ones who are the arbiters of truth and morality and justice, deciding what's right, what's wrong, what's love, what's hate. And so there will always be a God of a particular people. If it's not the God of the universe, the true God, then it's
some God.
Then it's either an idol, a pagan god, or it's the government itself fills that role socially.
Okay, so this is the part I think that the part where this gets messy is I'm going to throw out the messy topics: abortion, gay marriage. Like those are things where that is a moral thing.
Yep.
That Christians would say abortion is murder. Like that's where generally we're going to go. Abortion is murder. Then we're going to say same-sex marriage is outside the will of God. That is sin. All right. So, or adultery or whatever sin word you want to put on that. So then, how do we as Christians sort of talk about that amongst a pluralistic society where people don't have that same viewpoint on that being sin?
Yeah, and so a lot of people will say, as Christians, we shouldn't try to force our beliefs on other people.
Right.
Take that to the issue of slavery, though.
Exactly.
And everyone's going to go, well, you say, okay, so if you should people not have forced their idea of abolishing slavery on this, and so there's some people that might, who knows what answers you'll get with that, but for a lot of people, they're going to go, oh, well, yeah, that was one that it was good that we fought to abolish slavery.
Right.
So people actually understand this idea of if a culture has bad morals, that does not love your neighbor, that does not help your neighbor, that hurts people.
Right.
And therefore, superior morals need to be taught and legislated into society.
Even when it's
we know that deep down,
right.
But we don't think about it deeply, and so people say these surface level platitudes, about don't force your
don't
morality.
legislate morality. Yeah,
but that's all that you can do. All legislation is inherently moral.
You are saying this is moral. Right. And maybe the problem is, does everything get the death penalty? Probably not. But I do feel like
no.
even Jim Crow laws are separate but equal. We would say that is immoral based upon the dignity of each human being, regardless of red, yellow, black, or white.
Yeah.
I think that's the part where I think we've said don't legislate morality for so long that we didn't realize
makes
that
no sense.
It's because some things you can legislate except for the things that I disagree with.
Yes.
And I think that's the problem. So I think as Christians, we are called to then sort of, vote probably in a way that would legislate morality.
Exactly. There's the only possibility when it comes to voting. Voting, you are essentially, okay, so before voting, the less civilized way was war.
That's right.
You would have, no, I don't want the land. I don't want these to be the laws of this land. And
Right.
if you disagree, we will fight you. And voting is war by proxy, right?
Yep.
You cast your vote instead of draw your sword.
Yep.
And but the same premise is there of we want to establish the best morals, that if God's purpose for government is to promote what is good and to punish what is evil, that is an inherently moral thing. You're talking about good and evil.
Okay.
And so we want laws that promote good and punish evil.
Right.
And that's when you're voting, you are participating in an inherently moral activity.
Yes. Okay.
Yep.
So how do you now? This is where we know not all sins are equal in that every sin prevents you from getting to God. However,
Equally damning, not equally destructive.
Thank you. They're equally damning. That's man. Thank you. That was really good.
Stole it somewhere. I can't remember where.
Yeah, but it sounded like it was you, so it was genius. So
there you go.
As Holland said, equally damning, but not equally destructive. So a white lie and murder are equally damning, but not equally destructive. And I think sometimes we throw this verbiage around meaning one thing, but then we apply it to another, kind of like don't legislate morality. That doesn't make sense. We say all sins are equal, so why are we lifting one up? And we're not making a law about white lying, but we are making a law about abortion or gay marriage. So how do we sort of differentiate when we're looking at candidates? Let's just talking presidential candidates. How are we to differentiate? Because it's not like right now we have Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. It's not like either of these people really like beacon of hope, of righteousness, and talking about Jesus and all that. So how do we then, from the standpoint of like, I don't have someone that's clearly for Jesus, but I can make a decision that's best for my country with the options that I have. Yeah. And let's just talk through what those options are.
Yeah. Can I bring a couple Bible verses in?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
I think the whole Bible verse thing, it's actually a win.
You guys are into that here?
Yeah, we like the Bible around here. It's good.
Yeah, so let's go, I think, first of all, Romans 13. Talked about this earlier.
Yep.
Verse 3, rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you'll receive his approval. So approving of what is good is one purpose. And it says, verse 4, for he is God's servant for your good. So again, that's the role of the government. You serve God. Same word, deacon, a deacon of God for your good.
They're like, that's why we get the word minister, like a minister of defense or minister of whatever. It's the same thing.
From that, yeah. So a servant of God for the public good, to approve what is good. And then the next part it says, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God. Now, instead of approving what is good, it says he's a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. And earlier, again, it says there's no authority except from God. Those that exist have been instituted by God. So you do have this sense that God created the government, approve what is good, punish what is evil. So when it comes to voting and assessing candidates, I think the options that you have are... well, ideally, you would have Christian candidates. That's not even something people would agree with, though. You know, again, keep religion out of politics. But again, you can't when politics is inherently moral, when government is God's servant for the public good. Ideally, you would have a Christian candidate who rules according to God's law. One more verse. Can I bring up one more?
No, you get one more.
Psalm 2, verse 10 through 12. Now, therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear. Again, this is not Israel. He's not saying Israelite rulers of the earth. All the kings. That's who he's talking to. Rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear. Rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. For his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. He's instructing rulers to fear the Lord, to kiss the Son, to honor the Messiah, the Christ.
Yep.
And we know Psalm 2 is about Jesus from its allusions in the New Testament as well. So you have this expectation that all rulers are accountable to God. Daniel gives you examples of Gentile rulers that are judged by God for their arrogance and their refusal to fear him, their pride, their injustice that they were responsible for.
I think of Nebuchadnezzar right off the top of it.
Yeah, Belshazzar. So you have these examples of pagan Gentile kings that are judged for their refusal to fear God. So when it comes to the President of the United States, they're accountable to God. And
whether they want to acknowledge it
whether
or
they
not.
want to acknowledge it or not. And so that's why, it's terrible that presidential debates and stuff, no scriptures brought up, nothing about the fear of God, nothing about what the Bible says about justice. And that takes politics and government out of the context of what it's designed for, which is why, a lot of us think, no, we can't bring God into the government. We're talking about policy. But again, it's all under God and all accountable to God.
Right.
So if you don't have Christian candidates to vote for, I think in my opinion, I think your options are either one, don't vote at all, to say, I'm not going to cast a vote for someone who I think is unfit for this role, someone who's not going to fear God. Yep. I'm not going to cast a vote for them. You can write in a third party.
Write yourself
in. Do you know I was voted most likely to be president at high school?
Holland, Greig,
maybe.
Listen, this is your year, 2024.
Or your other option is to vote for the one that you think will either, two sides of the same coin, do the most good or do the least harm. Not necessarily the ideal, not a Christian, not someone who's going to rule in a fear of God, but someone who will do the most good, who will be most fit for approving things that are good and punishing things that are evil.
Yeah.
And so I think you have to look at, the track record of the candidates and what things they approve and what things they punish. And if they're not someone who acknowledges God, they themselves are essentially taking that position of deciding what's right and wrong, what's good and evil, what they're going to approve, what they're going to punish.
Yeah.
So that's one way I would say to think about it.
So Martin Luther had a nuanced view of this, like back in the day. He had the two kingdoms view. One was that you'd have a secular, it was established by God to maintain order and justice in society regardless of personal faith. And then you had the sacred rule of the church, and the two would overlap, but the church wasn't to have power over the government, but it should be able to speak into the government as a whole. And I think that's where we're at. But I think the problem for us, we don't live in a monarchy or with a princes or however, the feudal system of the 1500s. We live in a republic democracy, which is challenging to understand in and of itself. And so here we are, because as I listen to you, it's like, okay, not vote, best of, or the candidate that promotes the best well-being for the country, or the candidate that would hurt the least, or do the least evil. And so how do we know where the candidates are as far as good, evil? Like, how would he even process that to know kind of like, okay, I want to have the candidate that's going to promote the most good. I want to have the candidate that's going to promote the least evil.
Yeah. I think a couple of things. You look at their history. Trump served as president. You can assess what he did, what he accomplished, how he led, his character, his policies. Kamala, vice president, last few years, other political roles that she filled. You look at those. You look at the policies that they're claiming to move forward with, which there's no guarantee that'll actually happen. But you do have the Republican platform is posted online. Trump gave an updated one recently. Kamala posted hers recently for the Democrats. And you can look policy by policy and assess it according to the word. Okay, what's their stance on, like you brought up, abortion, marriage, immigration? How are they approaching? How are they justifying their positions? How does that line up with the Bible? And I think another verse I'll bring up, 1 Timothy 2, we're commanded to, Paul says, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. So that's what Paul says to pray for when it comes to rulers. I think that makes sense to vote in the same direction that we're commanded to pray.
Right.
What is going to lead to us being able to have a peaceful, quiet life, godly and dignified in every way? What policies are going to interfere the least with our ability to gather for worship, our ability to raise our children in the Christian faith? What is gonna hinder that the least or help that the most?
Right.
Yeah.
So let's think that through. I think the peaceful and quiet life thing is probably something that nobody thinks about. And in general, I don't think our social media feeds are full of peaceful and quiet. They're more full of like, you're the worst, my team's the best. I think, as I look at the vitriol that comes across social media from candidates and their supporters, it's like not a godly space. And so that's where it gets to be a struggle. So let's just kind of parse through some of this. I don't even know where we'd start. I think that's the part where you go, okay, I think usually the thing that most Christians look at is who's the most pro-life candidate? Yeah. And that's where, even that's changed over time on where people's stances are. Yeah. I think Donald Trump and Kamala Harris at one time probably were aligned, and then another time Trump shifted, and then another time Trump shifted again. So it's kind of one of those things where you look at, I think at one point, he's the one that nominated the most pro-life Supreme Court of all time that reversed Roe v. Wade. And you look at that and you're like, well, he must be a pro-life candidate. But what I've seen is that he's actually sort of backed off that position. He has, majorly, and is in the recent, the policy platform, Republican platform, doesn't say really anything in a pro-life position other than, trying to avoid late-term abortions, which is,
I would say Kamala is very vocal about support.
Right.
I mean, she's a champion for abortion.
Right.
Trump is not, but he's also not a champion for the pro-life cause. He
Right.
backed up. I don't know why, maybe to try to gain some moderate voters or something like that, or win some people over. But he totally backed off on where he was years ago.
I mean, years ago he was like
there's not a pro-life candidate
speaking
right
at
now.
like pro-life events. Like I think when the Million Woman March or some sort of thing where they had it on the Capitol, he went to it and spoke at it, and Roe v. Wade was overturned at some point after that, which is sort of wild to think about. Okay, so then.
So you can take an issue like that, I think, and you go, okay, what does the word say about this? Before it's a political issue, it's a theological, moral issue.
Right.
That there's political
ramifications, effects,
decisions that need to be made, but at the core of it, there's a theological and moral issue, right? So abortion is it moral to terminate the life of an unborn child? And you can look to the word, and it's pretty clear to me. No, it's not. It's the work of God in the womb. I talked about this this past Sunday at our church. This is stuff where people say, don't mix religion and politics. You can't talk about politics. And again, you got to say, before it's a political thing, it's a biblical, theological, moral thing. And so if God is the one knitting us together in the mother's womb, he's forming a human life, that it's wrong, immoral, unjust to take an innocent human life. Then that applies to abortion. You can say abortion is unjust, immoral. It's the murder of an unborn child. The political implications of that are we should punish what is evil,
right,
and not approve of it as a good thing.
And I think this gets to the point where it gets a little challenging, because where do you apply the punishment? Because I think at some places you're like, oh, well, it should be on the doctors, but then you're like, what about the woman or the family or the people, woman really ultimately, going in for the abortion? Should that person be punished? I think that's a question that is, I feel like for a long time that has, to be fair, to get to a place of where we're at, where Roe v. Wade is no longer the law of the land. Pro-life advocates haven't been like abortion and abolitionist, maybe the best way to put that. And because I think you're now seeing
some that are, but
for the most part,
you're right. Yeah.
And so, because I think we would say, don't we want to, like, if it were slavery, you would say we don't want any remnant of slavery around. We want that completely abolished. And the same thing I think we'd say with abortion. If we're viewing that as the murder of an unborn child, then you'd want that to be completely out. And I don't think any candidate is kind of talking in those types of terms. And so you're having to, I know is compromise the right word, whenever you vote for that, because you're going, here, this is going to move morality forward towards God, even if it won't get me all the way there.
Yeah. You're not voting for someone who you think is going to champion Christian values and principles, but for someone who is going to try to, or someone who's going to be less or more helpful or harmful, right? It's a strategic or a tactical, I don't know which one. Yeah. But essentially that's where I think, I know some people who are like, I'm not going to vote at all because I can't do so in good conscience. I respect that opinion, or that position, I mean. And I also, I have respect and understanding for people who go, I am going to vote because I think, if this person were to win, it would be detrimental to our society for XYZ ways. Yep. I think either of those positions is understandable, and you have, you can justify either one.
So let's talk through some of the primary issues. If I were to talk through, I think abortion is one. I think I think same-sex marriage is not really even a topic to be talked about, because I think we're beyond that as a country. But as a Christian, you would want to have up until 2014, the law of the land was a man and a woman. And Barack Obama would have said when he ran, like, a marriage between a man and a woman, and then until it's not. And so then you go, the past 10 years has been the amount of history we've had. Marriage is between whoever you want it to be with. I guess it's limited to one person, at least at this point. But where on the hierarchy of political thought, and I think this is really where the rubber meets the road in voting, is where do we rank abortion? Where do we rank same-sex marriage? Where do we rank immigration? Where do we rank economic policy? Where do we rank, all of that sort of leads to quiet still quiet lives at some point, but there's got to be some sort of, and maybe this could be the discernment of the Christian of which one is hierarchically most important.
Yeah, I think, so if you have the three institutions, family, church, government, you want the government to protect the rights of the family, the other two institutions,
right,
to be able to do what God's called them to do,
right,
not to interfere with those
right,
things. And so you go, well, what has God called the family and the church to do? You think of the cultural mandate in Genesis 1 and 2, be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth. So, what are godly families to do? Get married, have children, raise your children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Teach your children to obey the Lord. So Deuteronomy 6, right? So you have the institution of the family is you have marriage and child rearing, essentially. So when it comes to something like same-sex marriage, well, that's immediately relevant to God's command from the beginning and the institution of the family. Immediately relevant. And one of the purposes, if you look at the Reformation and they talked about like the different purposes of the law, speaking to God's law, but law in general, it can expose our sin. It can serve as a tutor or teach. It can is one of the purposes of the law is to teach. And so the idea of having the law of the land be something immoral, we have to understand that is teaching something to people. It does establish a culture. Sometimes culture influences politics, right? But the laws of a land are always going to influence the culture as well. So when you have a culture where anything goes with marriage, you end up where we are today with stuff, very concerning things being taught to children in elementary schools. And you have a culture where kids are very confused about their gender and sexuality and growing up in a culture that's totally lost when it comes to that. And so I would say
it's
something
disruptive to the family. Clearly.
It is, yeah. What is the church called to do? Gather for worship, make disciples, preach the gospel, Lord's Supper, baptism. So you have things that are going to impede religious freedom, your ability to assemble, to gather. Freedom of speech, is something that you start to lose freedom of speech, and now you cannot preach the gospel, right, without being punished or hindered.
Right.
So I would say there's things, if you look at what are the mandates for the other two institutions, as well as go to the Ten Commandments, that's God's moral law. Abortion's going to run up against
murder.
Thou shalt not murder, right?
But I think the hard part is then, what about like blasphemy, or what about don't make any graven images? I think that's where it gets challenging, right? I think in a culture, and I think it comes back from the Jefferson letter of separation of church and state when he said, if it doesn't pick my pocket or break my leg, then why I'm not going to worry about it.
Here's how it does, though.
Yeah.
Again, if you don't honor God as a government, as a nation, the government becomes God.
Yes. There
will always be blasphemy. It's just what is going to be considered. There's always going to be things that you're not allowed to say. And
you're not allowed to say something about like assassinating a sitting president or something like that.
Yeah,
right?
There's things that are forbidden to say
fire
or condemn.
Yeah.
So what a lot of people today would just the idea of hate speech is essentially a form of blasphemous speech.
Wow, you're right. So we already have that. You're exactly right.
We already have that. There are things that you're not allowed to say, whether it's punished legally or socially. There are things that are taboo, forbidden, that if you speak against this, you're going to get canceled. LGBTQ stuff, abortion, these are some of those things where...
But Jesus' name can be taken in vain all over the place,
right?
And nobody blinks an eye.
So it's not whether or not you have blasphemy laws, it's which ones you have.
I think that's huge. And I think what happens, I think for Christians, we've punted on this because we're not offended. And why is it, should we not be offended? Or is there a part where we've been not offended for so long, we've been conditioned to not be offended, whereas... people that are not believers have blasphemy laws that they're essentially ripping their clothes for when they hear someone say something that they might deem racist or sexist or transist or whatever the thing is.
Yeah.
Because the religion of the government has become supreme.
secular humanism, I would say, is the religion of our government.
Right.
And it has its own forms of blasphemy that are going to be punished. And Kamala even said, I think recently, speaking of like social media platforms and, she's like, I'm going to go after them and criminalize hate speech on social media. Essentially, and so who decides what's hateful? Well, the government does.
Right.
So if it's something that she hates, if it goes against her policies, you lose freedom of speech to speak the truth about gender, about sexuality, about marriage, about abortion. That can all be categorized as hate speech that is now punishable, a form of blasphemy laws.
So I think we're seeing the negative consequences of Christians not speaking up for what we see as true blasphemy, maybe. And I've always thought that why are you so upset about who cares what that person says?
Yeah.
But when you're not offended by, is it like when you're not offended by it?
Yeah, it's not as much about that hurt my feelings or that personally offended me. I think it's about upholding a standard of what is right and wrong. And should people be allowed to, publicly blaspheme their creator?
Wow.
And, not because it offends me or it hurts my feelings or something, but what kind of culture does it create when that is tolerated or even celebrated?
But I feel like every show I've ever watched, like Adrian and I usually watch action shows, Jesus's name is taken in vain at least 20 times.
What is the effect that has on culture over years and years and years?
It's just Jesus Christ.
Deteriorates your view of Jesus Christ.
Right, and it just turns Jesus' name into an expletive.
Exactly.
And
we have to understand that as a strategy of the enemy to really disillusion people and to mislead people into thinking, that name's just it's an expletive. It's a curse word. There's no honor in his name. There's no,
especially when that name is what sets you free from the demonic, sets you free from...
Exactly.
It's wild to think about. So that's why I know
How can we make society think the remedy to their problem is
Mm-hmm.
actually something dirty and foul to say when you're upset or
So, you go back 70 years ago, and I think you had a high honor for Jesus' name, but maybe a low honor for the Imago Dei in people. I don't know. I'm just going to I'm throwing stuff out there. Before the 64 civil rights law and a lot of the civil rights stuff, you just saw a reversal of like high honor for Jesus's name, low honor for the Imago Dei. And now the Imago Dei has taken, to what your point is, secular humanism has become the religion du jour, and then Christianity is something that we're like poo-pooing that, and we just need to kind of relegate it to the relic of the past, and to bring it up into public policy is draconian and very dated. And I would say probably as we're watching the destruction of American culture, as it's probably in one ways it's being built, right, in the sense for the darkness, and the kingdom of light seems to be taking a hit as far as an American culture for what is right and what is wrong. And it gets very difficult to distinguish it when a lot of it is more morally being promoted by the government, that sex is just a part of life, and we need to train you that you're probably you might not be the right, whatever you're born, it could be different. You could be, if you're a 4-year-old boy, you might be a 4-year-old girl. And so let's not put any labels on anything, and let's let you make your own choices. And that goes clearly against the biblical teaching of how to raise a family. So this is where the government is impeding the family by making laws, legislating morality to tell you that your child should be able to choose their gender, that sex should never be ever... should be at any time, anywhere, as long as it's consensual. That murder is something that is a woman's choice, that if it's within her own body. And I think that's where we're just really struggling. And I think maybe we've deviated from the actual thing of like who we're going to vote for. But I think
there's a lot of stuff underneath that you got to understand before you can answer that question.
Of like, what is government supposed to do? Now, here's back in the there was 1,000 years-ish of where you saw the Holy Roman Empire, or the emperor and the pope, and everyone sort of, it was like this power struggle. Where you would have certain rulers that would be keen on supporting a certain religious view and would sort of murder off the entire culture that didn't support it. They would take death penalty seriously and blasphemy. If someone argued for a round earth that didn't go with the teaching of the day of the church, they were, potential to be killed or at least imprisoned. And so what do we do with that history? I think that's where people look back at and they go, see, clearly it didn't work.
Yeah, so I think a common error that people make is to look at how something has not worked and then throw the thing out completely, right? And so you see that in a lot of different ways.
Like with marriage, people go, I've never seen a marriage work, so clearly marriage is dumb.
Yeah, that's what's going on, I think, culturally, what's going on with masculinity and male authority right now. Hey, we've seen toxic masculinity, we've seen abusive men, and therefore masculinity is bad. Right. Men in leadership is bad. Men, and so let's oppose that. And I think the right way to do it is to say, okay, this was done poorly in this instance. How was it meant to be done, though? And let's pursue that. And so some people will look at, hey, Christian rulers or Christian government or something like that has been done poorly in the past. Let's abandon it completely. That's how a lot of people think of it. Instead of saying, how could we reform it? How could we do it right? How could we do it as intended in Scripture? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think that's the route to go, is not abandoning the idea of, really seeking a nation and a government that honors God in the way that it rules and legislates and looks to Scripture as the standard for morality. I think that's the right direction. And this is what has been. A lot of people don't understand that, like, if you look at like the Westminster Confession of Faith or the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, and some of these like catechisms and documents as the church, Calvin's Institutes. I mean, there's chapters and chapters and questions and answers. This was something that used to be taught really thoroughly, and we don't have to try to figure it out right now. People a lot of people will take the Reformed teaching on soteriology, God's sovereignty and salvation, but don't look at all in what, the Reformed teaching on government, right? And there's tons of resources on this and how to think about this. It's not a new novel idea. So I think we got to look backward a little bit and recover some things that, that we've lost in the modern evangelical church today, to get some wisdom and insight.
Yeah, I think that's what's the challenge, is like it feels so overwhelming that it's almost hopeless, right? I think that's where I think a lot of Christians go. It's like there's no point. And I think we need to challenge that. And here's what I mean by that. In the golden age of a theocracy, and theocracy is just where God is the king and he had judges, or God is the king and he had a earthly king like David or Solomon or Saul, it still was jacked up. Yeah. The government still did wrong things. Right. And although,
as long as humans are involved, there will be problems.
Like even Solomon, like conscription of his own people to build the temple and to build his palaces and to build all the public works. It's like, dude, like you might have been wise, but you were just shrewd and then he left the faith. I mean, he kind of went to a place where
threw it away by the end of his life.
And you're like, why? And so if we look at that, I think this is my struggle. I go, when we had the opportunity with the theocracy where God literally had prophets telling the kings what to do and priests, implementing the king's rule and an army that fought by the power of God, we still had corruption, we still had brokenness, and it could only last for, we'll give King Saul. He had 40 years. David had another 40-ish, and Solomon 4. So for 120 years, you had this one like monotheistic monarchy that ruled with God's law. And even then, even beyond that, you still didn't take down the high places, which God commanded. There were so many things that ultimately were led for reform that were missed by kings who literally were all their whole job was, and they had all the wealth and all the money and all the power to implement, but because of their own dark hearts, maybe fear of the people, and they couldn't see God to implement morality as the way they should, they failed. And I think If we're looking for on this side of heaven, and this is why this is my pitch for don't not vote. Yeah, like vote. In other words, vote. Like when you just take yourself fully out. Well, I feel like it is, and I think I like where you say you respect people who don't who don't vote.
I understand the reasoning behind it.
You respect it for what it is, but man, I think for me it's like we have an opportunity to, we're not going to wage war, and I think, obviously that doesn't fit within a Christian context unless you have a sovereign state declaring war and power of the sword and all that. Now we get into just war theory, but within the state,
you're talking about as the church as an institution, we're not going to wage war.
We're not going to wage war unless you develop a new state that's not part of the church, because that's
it would be the state waging war, though.
It would be the state waging war, and I think that's the struggle that we have is the church doesn't have, and rightfully so, as the way Jesus, it doesn't have the power of the sword. That is clearly given to the state, and so our role is to prophetically speak into the state and do it righteously, do it boldly, and do it humbly. I think that's the part of this that I think has been pressed on my heart as I've watched the, starting when I guess it was 2014, whenever the gay marriage law came out. And I honestly, I remember when Adrian and Leah and Tay all made the, we're going to see Roe v. Wade taken away in our lifetime. And I remember when Adrian did that video with Leah, I was like, there's no way.
Yeah.
There is no way that's changing. And then when that changed, I was like, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So we do, not that we don't matter, but we do matter, and our political participation matters of moving the gospel forward and righteousness moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you said the church speaking prophetically to the state is one. Our vote is another aspect. So, our witness, the way we speak, the way we vote, as well as, I think, having Christian people advancing in those roles from a local level, state senators, mayors, things like that, all the way up to a presidential level. How awesome would it be to see a Christian, unashamedly Christian president who says, I'm going to rule in the fear of God, and we're going to set our moral standards according to what God says is right and wrong. We're going to protect the innocent. We're going to punish evil. We're going to approve what is good. And there are Christians in those kind of roles at local levels who are serving. It's kind of rare to see that. A lot of people in the political world are fearful of sharing their Christian convictions for sake of, I'm not going to win if I do that.
Yeah.
But there are some who do win and who are doing well. There's also people who just give lip service to God and say that they're Christians, and yet the way that they rule is totally, pagan and unchristian-like. And so, but I would say it's totally possible, because with God all things are possible, to see the culture of our country change. To see, like you said, I never thought, Roe v. Wade.
Honestly, I thought that was, I was like, Leah, that's really cute, but that's never going to happen.
And God, it is possible to live in a country where abortion is abolished.
Yeah.
And it is possible to live in a country that upholds biblical standards for marriage and children and gender and sexuality. We often think that, only think in terms of the institution of the church and the family, and that the government belongs to the secular world, but the government belongs to God.
Yeah. I feel like I need to make a Venn diagram of like the different roles of government, church, and family.
And part of what it means to, have dominion, to subdue the earth, the command that we're given as image bearers of God, involves the political realm. To have dominion in the way of ruling justly. That's part of how we love our neighbors. Laws that don't protect people from evil are not loving.
Right.
Laws that leave the poor vulnerable to being exploited and taken advantage of, it's not a loving law.
Right.
So we have to think more holistically about what it means to love our neighbor, to have dominion, that it's not just the family and the church that belong to God, the government, the state belongs to God and is accountable to God.
So I want to talk just real quickly on a couple things, and I know this might be overdoing it. But
Yeah.
we talked about abortion. I think we hammered that. We talked about same-sex marriage, got that. Let's talk immigration for a second. And how should a Christian view that?
Yeah. I think there's an aspect of it that is, again, a moral, theological principle, but then there's also political paths or political approaches to take.
Right.
That you could share the same biblical convictions about certain principles and yet end up in different places politically.
Right.
I think that's totally understandable.
I feel like as long as you're coming from not just that I'm following whatever my political party says, but I actually have biblical conviction that I'm following. And then if the political party lines up, I either agree with it or I speak truth into it.
And you've got to be able to go deeper than just the platitudes so like, I think there's just some foolishness that people say when it comes to this issue. And it, is like essentially equate any kind of stance about being, certain immigration policies or secure borders or, walls, things like this is immediately interpreted as you don't love your neighbor or you're racist or something. Whereas, most of the people having these conversations and that push back against that live in some walls and lock their doors at night and don't allow just anyone to come in.
Right.
There's the idea of...
So there's a hypocrisy that we're seeing clearly.
Yes, there's this shallow level of conversation.
But let's talk biblically, because I think that, like, for me, when I look at, like, boundaries or walls or whatever, borders, the Bible says don't move a sacred boundary stone. And what it was talking about, don't take a border and move it and say that that's mine.
Yeah.
That was kind of like a Leviticus law in Leviticus of moving boundary stones. And what you were doing is like, I want to take your property, move in and farm your land and say that it's mine. Okay.
Yeah.
And then also, just when you look at that, if a state doesn't have the ability to say, this is what I'm here to protect and preserve, then it doesn't have any power at all, because there is no state. Without a boundary, there is no state.
Exactly.
Because then it kind of reminds me, within the church has this. The church has members. We always are going to have non-believers, non-Christians coming to our church, but there are certain people that we have authority over, in a sense, and there are people that we want to love and care for and all of that. But what happens is you're not called to have, you don't hold a non-believer to the same standard as a believer. In the same way, you don't allow non-citizens to have all the rights and privileges of citizens without being a citizen of that country, because the country is there to protect and provide and secure its own citizens. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
How do we? Because I think what happens is we call borders. I think there's a whole movement. I think a lot of Christians would call it this, and this is the part I have a hard time theologically justifying that position of how you would say a border is sinful, or I don't. But there's got to be somebody that has a perspective on how borders are actually a problem.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah,
I don't know the biblical justification. Yeah. Usually, you hear that's justified with things like generally love your neighbor, or love the foreigner among you.
Right.
The ancient Israelite laws in Deuteronomy or something, which is funny because it's usually the same people who say, "Don't force your morality on me. Don't legislate morality."
Right.
But then they'll point to
a Bible verse,
and a biblical law from the Old Testament to support their position on immigration. It's funny and hypocritical to me. But
also on that, it's so whenever a foreigner did sojourn or travel to Israel amongst God's people, they had to agree to live under the laws of Israel. Like they had to keep the Sabbath day. They had to do everything other than get circumcised. I mean, it was sort of like a wild like reality of like they could worship their own, I guess, God in the privacy of their own home, but they weren't allowed to blaspheme. They weren't allowed to do a whole lot of stuff that everyone else would say that's crazy. They had to live under the laws of the community of Israel, which would probably include proper immigration status.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, there's again, I think it's wise to draw some principles from that more than just seek to copy paste some of those laws.
Yeah.
But to draw principles from it. But I think it's important to establish that you can love the stranger and love the foreigner
Right.
and love the
Yep.
and at the same time have a wise policy about how people enter into how people cross that border,
Right.
enter into your nation, become a citizen, and the idea that any level of borders, anytime you say no, that's unloving and evil. I think that's foolishness, and it's not how we live our own lives. It's not how we conduct our families, our own households. We have boundaries in our home, and we do that for safety and security in terms of who comes in and who we let in. A nation is not the same thing as a family, but a nation, if you think of creation of the world, nations are what happened when families grew and became more families and more families, and you had to think of, well, how do we govern and have order with a collection of families? And you're going to apply a lot of similar principles that you apply to a household. The Reformed tradition viewed rulers, national rulers, as the father of that nation. It was a fatherly role in the same way that, Paul talks about the church being the household of God. Government and church, those institutions really look to the family as a model. The church is a household model. It's your brothers and sisters, right? 1 Timothy 5, don't rebuke an older man, but encourage him as a father. Older women as mothers. It's built on family principles.
Right.
In the same way, a government shares a lot of similarities in essentially being a very, very large family.
Right.
And a household in a sense. And so to have borders and to be wise about who comes in and out is very biblical. It's not an unloving or hateful thing.
And I think that's a struggle. Let's talk about the poor for a second, because I think this is one that usually conservatives are seen as like they don't love the poor, and liberals are like all about the poor. And to be fair, I think at least when I'm looking at least on social media, it looks like a lot more liberal churches are supporting the poor than conservative. But I mean, you would say that's not true, and I would say that's not true. But I feel like that's the stereotype is conservatives don't care about the poor, only the liberals do. But let's just talk real quick about what's the Bible say about caring for the poor.
That you should do it.
That you should do it. Like, right. I think it's like,
it's a pretty big deal to God.
Pure is this, taking care of orphans and widows in their distress.
Yeah.
And so I feel like there's
I'm preaching on that here in a couple weeks.
Oh, yeah, you are. That's right. You don't want to miss it.
That's right.
And so what happens, I think, is we find that I think what happens with church is a lot of what we do, especially with poor, isn't shouted from the rooftops, right? I mean, it's almost like when you. What
do you mean?
Well, like we're sort of commanded giving to the poor, like that's between you and God.
Like don't let your right hand know what your left.
Right. Yeah. And honestly, when it comes to giving, that's the only type of giving that you're supposed to keep secret, right?
Yeah.
Because clearly the widow,
Alms.
when she gives her two coins, that's in front of everybody. And like when that and God Jesus didn't like go, well, look what that widow was doing.
Right.
But it is when it comes to giving to the poor. I don't know if that is why we're not like more out loud about it, I guess. I mean, one of the things that we love at our church is, and I know that you guys do as well, is our benevolence ministry. We give away a lot of money, pay a lot of rent. But one of the things we do here is we go over your budget. Zach Bice is our benevolence guy, and Aaron Swalland, our deacon of compassion, is goes through people with their budget to help them see what they're bringing in and what they're going out. And we're not trying to just give someone, here's the next drug money for your next hit. We want to pay a specific bill, and so we pay rent, we pay car payments, we pay specific things to help them keep going. But I feel like this gets back to the government as religion. When the government takes that over and then makes people get paid without working, I think that becomes problematic.
Yeah, I mean, there's wise and foolish ways to help the poor, right? You can there are ways that you can do something for someone that maybe feels to you like you're helping, and maybe even feels to them in the moment like you're helping, but is actually perpetuating some poor habits. And there's what you guys are talking about with, hey, let me see your budget. You're offering discipleship and accountability to not just meet an immediate need, but actually help care for a person toward a biblical understanding of stewarding their resources.
Aren't you doing that at your church right now, as far as like teaching people about how to handle money?
Yeah. I mean, we just finished a little Bible study series on that, teaching through it, biblical principles about financial stewardship, wealth, giving, saving, all that kind of stuff. We do the same kind of thing when we help someone with bills. It's coupled with accountability and discipleship, and it's relational. And so when it comes to how do we help the poor, depending on what, I think you'd have to look at specific policies and assess one by one. Okay,
so I think
what is this aiming to accomplish?
You can't just blanket say all welfare programs are bad or all welfare programs are good. I think that's the struggle.
Yeah.
So I think for me, when I look, I remember that book that we had to read. I don't know if we had to read, but we did read when we worked back in the day in Dallas with I Am Second with When Helping Hurts. Yeah. And I think we talked about Haiti, I think specifically, and how more money has been given to Haiti than any other nation, like I think combined, and it's still in poverty. So money doesn't solve the problem. It's righteousness, like right government structure. That's where I feel like government becomes, I don't want to say the solution, but administering money well, so that you're not, when I think, in Proverbs, when the fool rules over the prince, the whole nation fails or whatever. I think that's the struggle that you saw, is like money was spent or money was given to people who were fools and didn't have wisdom and insight. And Haiti is still struggling because of the corruption, because of the impropriety, because of all those different aspects. And so I think that's where you got to look at spending money wisely. And that's why I love a lot of our country is always investigating, like, where's money being spent and why? What do you, any thoughts on that, as far as when you're talking about giving to the poor, or not giving to the poor, like just how a country manages taking care of the poor as part of being righteous?
I think we have to understand poverty is more than just financial. It is, there is a relational and spiritual aspect to poverty, that a lot of, if I were to if my car were to break down right now, I go outside and it doesn't start, the relationships that I have, I'm not worried. I know that I could get a ride. I know someone could pick me up. I know someone, if I needed to, could help me, right? I am relationally wealthy.
Yes.
And that I have relationships with people who are invested in my life. If you don't have that, and a financial problem comes, you're screwed. You don't have anyone that who can help you, that you can call. So relational poverty, spiritual poverty. If you don't understand spiritual principles about finances, you're going to be a poor steward of what you do have. Someone could give you 10 grand, and you don't know what
to do with
that. You don't know, no one's taught you wisdom, what Proverbs says, what scriptures say about finances. So there's a spiritual and relational aspect to poverty that I don't necessarily think the government is not equipped to the government has a role in caring for the poor, but so does the church, and so do families.
Right.
Paul said, if anyone doesn't care for his relatives, he's worse than an unbeliever.
Right.
So families are the first line of defense, in a sense, in terms of caring for poverty.
Right.
And you're responsible for your relatives.
And
then the church, when Paul talks about widows, it says first, if she has any children who are able to help her, let them take care of her so the church is not burdened, right?
Right.
The church is there to help those who have no one, who are what Paul calls who are truly widows, true widows, those who are really left all alone.
And you had to be
is what he
over,
said.
what, 60?
Yeah.
And that
meet a number of qualifications, to have washed the feet of the saints, like you had to be righteous and
very
godly.
much all about dedicating yourself
So
to
they
prayer.
didn't just throw money to everyone.
Right.
They wanted to be wise stewards. Paul had rules. If you don't work, you don't eat. That could apply to the poor and the lazy, as well as the rich who exploited the poor
Right.
And didn't work. And so there was
I like that.
there was an expectation, though. Yeah, you need to work. You need to be a hard worker. If you're a widow and you have children, you go to your family first.
Yep.
So family's first line of defense, then church, and then because that's who's going to be able to provide the relational wealth and the spiritual wealth that is needed to accompany the financial wealth. So family and church really have to should really be the first lines of defense when it comes to helping with poverty.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's just kind of, I want to wrap this up because we've been on this for a bit, but I do like, where do we go to find out? Like, I think that if you went to just sort of Google Democrat platform or Google Republican platform, you could see kind of where people are standing, and you'll be able to see the moral issues pretty clearly. And I think the wisdom is this producing in our country the righteousness that God would desire? And being bold about that. I think that's an okay thing to be bold about.
Yep.
At the same time, compassionate, humble, and all of those things. But I think that's where you go to sort of figure out like where. And I think you could end up at different spots. Like you have a believer that within the hierarchy of their beliefs puts same-sex marriage above immigration, or like you're gonna hierarchically put those things at different spots. But for the most part, you're gonna want to push towards what most aligns with a Christian worldview that will be for the most good.
Yep.
His glory, our good, even through government.
Peaceful, quiet life, going to not hinder your family and your church as much as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, those are really real possibilities.
Yeah.
I mean, there's, churches losing, being, think of how to go about this quickly, since you said you wanted to wrap up.
No, we don't need, I mean, like
possibility to lose your freedom to gather as a
Right.
church if you don't believe X, Y, Z, right?
Right.
We don't want to end up in that situation. We celebrate, the underground church movements in different places around the world, and we're like, man, those guys are awesome. I don't want that to be the case here,
Right.
though.
Right.
I love living in a place where we can preach the gospel and gather for worship freely, and that's not a guarantee depending on who the president is. It's not a guarantee. We got to understand, like, if we want to live in a place where we can live in, peaceful, quiet life, where we can gather for worship, raise our kids to know and follow Jesus. We're homeschooling our kids right now,
Right.
but there's some places where homeschooling, has been illegal historically.
Right.
And you've got to put your kid in the state
Right.
school,
Right.
where who knows what
They're going to teach
secular humanism or Islam or whatever the state is.
Right.
So there's real ramifications for a government that does not honor God, and I would say go back to 1 Timothy 2. Pray for kings and all who are in high. Pray for our rulers. Pray for presidents to get saved and fall on their face, come to faith in Jesus Christ, and rule in the fear of God. Like, that is totally possible. You mentioned Nebuchadnezzar earlier.
Yeah.
I mean, he changed the law of the land from, if you don't, bow down to this golden idol, this statue, you die, to no one is allowed to speak a word against Yahweh.
Yeah.
He changed the law of the land to that.
That was legislating morality.
It was, and it's presented in a positive way of
Right.
like that was a win.
Yeah.
So I think, man, praying for that. We got to be people who pray for our nation, for our rulers, for our governors, state, local, national level. Like that was never something that was an emphasis in churches that I belonged to, or I just didn't notice it because I didn't care about it.
Right.
Maybe.
Yeah. And I think for evangelicals, for the most part, have been like, let's not worry so much about the government. Let's worry about discipling people to make the right decisions. And I don't know if we've lost. COVID, I think, caused a lot of loss of ground in that, because it was like this political weird spot where if you allowed people to worship without mass, clearly you were of the devil and you wanted to kill people. And you lost an entire left of center Christian base. And so that all that you were left with was the right of center. And so I think that's where, if you've lost all that entire swath of people that were no longer, those people generally said, I'm done. They're the ex-evangelicals, right? Like they've in the past 4 years have said no to the church, I'm out. And so now I think it's all the more important for Christians to sort of like speak into truth and have a wise, discerning reason, not just because I said so, but because here's what God's word says. And and if we're everybody, I think just saying everything legislates morality. Don't ever get away from like the government shouldn't legislate morality. The government is legislating.
Yeah. Which morality do you want to submit to and give the final say in this nation? Yeah. Not all moralities are equal.
I love it. Well, hey, thanks so much for watching. If you've got any further questions, you can text us here at 737-231-0605 or go to pastorplek.com. We would love to answer you, go through questions. We love this stuff. And it's tough to wrestle through. And so, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. From our house to yours, have an awesome week of worship.